Welcome to session 337 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 3rd of December. Today we'll be looking at Hebrews 9 to 10 and Psalm 27. But so far in Hebrews, we've read through the comparison between Jesus and the angels, the Torah, Moses, the Promised Land, the priesthood, and the Old Covenant. Likely written in the 60s CE to Jewish Christians, this letter demonstrates how everything in the Old Testament points towards Jesus. The letter opened establishing the supremacy of Jesus in all things. Where previously God spoke to his people through his prophets, he now speaks through Jesus. The author compared Jesus to angels, emphasizing that while angels served as messengers, Jesus serves as the Son of God. He created and sustains all things and rules as king. We saw how rejecting the Torah, which was believed to be delivered by angels, brought judgment. Therefore, rejecting Jesus' salvation must bring a much greater consequence. Unlike the Torah's focus on law and judgment, Jesus brought freedom and redemption. By taking on humanity, Jesus fulfilled humanity's role to rule creation. He suffered and died and then rose again to defeat death and sin. He now leads believers into glory as his brothers and sisters. The author compared Jesus to Moses, noting that while Moses faithfully served as a prophet and priest, Jesus is greater. Moses was a servant in the tabernacle, but Jesus is the Son of God over God's house. He is the ultimate temple where believers meet with God. Those who trust in Jesus become part of God's household and share in his greater promise. The author warned against hardening hearts like the Israelites in the wilderness. Their lack of faith kept them from the promised land's rest. Believers now have hope in a greater rest through Jesus, one that begins now and will be fully realized in God's eternal kingdom. They are called to remain faithful, encouraging one another and trusting in Jesus' promise of eternal rest. The author highlighted Jesus as the perfect high priest. Appointed by God, he offers eternal salvation through his obedience and suffering. Unlike human priests who must atone for their own sins, Jesus' perfection empowers believers to overcome sin. The readers were rebuked for spiritual immaturity and urged to grow beyond just basic teachings like repentance and faith. A warning was given against those who repeatedly reject transformation and risk becoming hardened against the gospel. Despite this, the author expressed hope in the reader's growth. They encouraged trust in God's promises and holding fast to the hope provided through Jesus, the eternal high priest. The author explained Jesus as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a king and priest who blessed Abraham and symbolized an eternal priesthood with no recorded lineage or death. Psalm 110 verse 4 pointed to a future priest-king fulfilled in Jesus. Unlike the mortal and sinful Levite priests who needed sacrifices, Jesus is perfect and eternal. He offers a better hope and requires no such offerings. He brought a new covenant which replaced the old. This covenant transforms hearts and minds, enabling people to know God personally. Unlike the outward law of the old covenant, as both king and eternal priest, Jesus established a superior priesthood and covenant, fulfilling what the old could not. But let's jump into today's reading, Hebrews 9 to 10. Continuing on with looking at the covenant, the author examines the Old Testament covenant. The tabernacle was set up as a meeting place with God. The normal, everyday people would meet with God outside the tent. The priests were then able to go inside the tent, deeper into God's presence. There was the furniture and utilities that had been set apart as holy to be used in God's presence. But then inside the tabernacle was another space, the Holy of Holies. There it had the holiest items that were dedicated to God. While the priest could enter the tabernacle, only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and even then just once a year. He would need to take the blood of sacrifices to cleanse him of his sins so he could go into God's presence. The author of Hebrew points out that the sanctuary, the very centre of God's presence, cannot be entered under the Old Covenant. The Holy of Holies was just a shadow, a model of the centre of God's presence. And this shadow could only be entered by the high priest, no one else. And even then, only once a year when he had cleansed himself with blood. This is the best that the Old Covenant sacrifices could achieve. It could temporarily purify people to come close to God, and it could show as an example of a better way that was to come. That better way came with Jesus. He gives access to the very centre of God's presence, the greater and perfect tent, as the author puts it in Hebrews 9:11. He now has permanent access, not because of animal blood, but because of his own blood that had cleansed all sin. While animal blood was used for temporarily purifying people, the blood of Jesus is good for purifying the conscience of people, so that people are transformed from the inside out, no longer wanting to indulge sin. This means that Jesus is now responsible for a new covenant that gives believers access to God's presence forever. His death has redeemed believers from any condemnation they would have had under the old covenant. The author then uses the metaphor of a will, though the Greek word is actually the same word for covenant, diathekes. Wills set up an agreement that only comes into place when someone dies. Then someone can receive an inheritance or a blessing. The old covenant relied on the death of animals in order to be legitimized. So while the Old Covenant and tabernacles needed these deaths and sacrifices, the real thing, the sanctuary, needed something greater. Jesus didn't enter a tabernacle that was a shadow or a model. He entered the real thing, heaven and the presence of God itself. He doesn't need to keep entering in with a fresh supply of his blood. Instead, he entered once and dealt with sin altogether. Regular humans die once, and then they face judgment for how they have lived their lives. Jesus already died once, and his death covered the judgment of all. So when he returns, he will not need to die or make sacrifice again. Instead, when he comes, it will bring freedom for those who are seeking him. The old covenant was a shadow of the new one. It didn't do the job properly and never could. Instead, it existed to be a reminder to the Israelites that their sin is a problem and it needs fixing. The blood of animals was never going to fix it. The author quotes Psalm 40 verse 6-8, showing that there was always an understanding that God wasn't interested in sacrifices and offerings in of themselves. Instead, he wanted obedience and faithfulness. The old covenant was just a pointer to that. But interestingly, the author puts the words of the psalm into Jesus' lips. Jesus is the one acknowledging that God was never interested in sacrifices and offerings. And Jesus is the one offering themselves up as one obedient, willing to do God's will. Jesus' new covenant does away with the old sacrifices that God was never interested in and brings in the obedience and faithfulness, leading by example. We are sanctified through his faithfulness. And having made this greater sacrifice, Jesus now sits at the right hand of God, waiting for his enemies to be submitted under his feet. Again, we're looking at that now, but not yet. Jesus has made the ultimate perfect sacrifice, but we're still looking forward to the day where death and evil will finally be defeated. Because of this sacrifice, there is now no sin for believers, because their sin has been dealt with. Not only is it covered by Jesus' sacrifice, but this new covenant involves transformation of the heart and minds so that believers are no longer shaped by sin. This brings the author to the peak of the letter. Therefore, in light of everything we've learned, the fact that Jesus is greater than angels or the Torah or Moses or the Promised Land, that he is a high priest greater than the old priests, and he brings a covenant that is greater than the old one, that we can enter the very presence of God because of Jesus' blood. In light of all that, may believers now approach God with true hearts. May they hold fast to the faith that they have in Jesus. May they consider how to encourage one another in doing good and gathering together. That is the response to this great truth. Because if a believer were to continue in indulging in sin after hearing all of that, then there is no other sacrifice that can be offered to them. Jesus' sacrifice is the last final offering. There's nothing else coming. Those that rejected the old covenant were punished severely. So how much more will those who reject the new covenant and the sacrifice of Jesus be punished? We know that God is not afraid to enact judgment and punishment. We've seen it many times before. The author then recalls when their original readers first got saved. They were willing to go through struggles and public persecution and stand with others who were doing the same. They had compassion on those in prison and had cheer in the face of persecution. The author encourages them to hold on to that confidence they once had. They need to not falter in it, but persevere, for Jesus will return. They don't want to be among those who abandon the faith, but among those who have remained obedient and faithful. That's Hebrews 9-10. Now let's look at Psalm 27. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm, where the psalmist brings their struggles before God. While lament psalms normally start with a complaint and work towards declaring trust in God, this psalm opens on a foundation of trust. It is structured in a chiasm, where the passage reflects itself, as though the psalmist lay out all the things they trust about God, and then places their requests and struggles within that. Here is a summary of the structure, but I'd recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verse 1, the Lord is my strength. Verses 2-3, my enemies. Verse 4, let me dwell in the Lord's presence. Verse 5, the Lord take me in. Verse 6, 3 positive declarations. Verse 7, hear me. And then it begins to reflect itself. Verse 8, let me see you. Verse 9, 3 negative requests. Verse 10, the Lord will take me in. Verse 11, lead me in your ways. Verse 12, my enemies. And then verse 13-14, be strong in the Lord. The psalm opens with the declaration that the Lord is the psalmist's strength. Because of this strength, it doesn't matter what their enemies or opponents throw at them. They will not stumble or fear because they have God. Next, the psalmist stands their ground on something they have been asking God for a while. May they stand in his presence. They can have confidence in this because the Lord is the one who gathers and protects his people. Because of the Lord, there are 3 things that the psalmist can now do. They can hold their head high, they can make offerings with joy, and they can sing praise to God. With this foundation laid, the psalmist then asks God to hear their prayers. And this is where the psalm begins to reflect itself. They ask God to hear them and then ask that they might see God. They have stated 3 things they can do because of God and now ask God not to do these 3 things. Hide his face, turned the psalmist away in his anger, and cast out the psalmist from his presence. He once again states the truth that the Lord is a God who gathers and protects those that are his, and asks the Lord to lead them in his ways. Finally, they make one more request, that they not be handed over to their enemies, and then they end where they began. The Lord is their strength. Through this psalm, we see how a proper understanding of who God is can lead us to make big asks that he'd not forsake us. Instead, we can seek him to lead us and protect us in our struggles. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.